There is a very specific, suffocating silence that falls over a dining room when a tyrant realizes he is utterly outclassed. It doesn't happen with a shout or a dramatic physical confrontation. It happens in the span of a single breath. Dwayne Smith believed his 8-figure bank account gave him the divine right to treat service workers like scuff marks on his Italian leather shoes. He was loud, he was cruel, and he was completely unaware that the exhausted waitress he was currently berating wasn't just a girl carrying plates. She was a ghost from a world he was desperately trying to buy his way into. This is the story of how a few sentences, spoken in perfect aristocratic French, shattered a millionaire's ego and dismantled his power play before the appetizers even arrived. The air inside Le Chapitre, Chicago's most pretentiously exclusive French dining room, always smelled faintly of white truffles, aged oak, and desperation. To the patrons, it was the scent of success. To Isabella Hayes, it was the smell of a 12-hour shift that was already eroding the cartilage in her knees. Isabella was 27, though the harsh, recessed lighting of the restaurant service alleys made her look older. She stood by the brass-plated espresso machine, wiping down a marble counter with a damp linen cloth, her mind miles away from the clinking crystal and the low, murmuring hum of wealth that permeated the dining room. She adjusted her starched white apron, smoothing out the wrinkles over her black tailored trousers. In this room, she was invisible. That was the rule of high-end service. You were meant to be a ghost who poured the water, presented the plates, and vanished before the conversation resumed. Isabella preferred the invisibility. It was easier than answering questions about how a girl with her pedigree had ended up here. 5 years ago, Isabella had been living in the 7th arrondissement of Paris, finishing her master's degree in international law at the Sorbonne. Her father, Thomas Hayes, had been a highly respected international trade consultant. They had spent summers in the Loire Valley and winters in Chamonix. Isabella had grown up navigating the complex, unspoken rules of European high society. She knew the difference between a Bordeaux and a Burgundy before she was legally allowed to drink either. She spoke French not just fluently, but natively, possessing the specific, clipped, effortless accent of the Parisian elite. But then the bottom fell out. Her father's business partner embezzled millions, framing Thomas in the process. The legal fees had drained everything. The stress triggered a massive heart attack that took her father's life, leaving Isabella and her mother drowning in a sea of debt and shattered reputations. Isabella had to drop out, return to the States, and take the highest-paying, cash-in-hand jobs she could find to keep her mother's modest apartment out of foreclosure. She traded her tailored Chanel blazers for a waitress uniform, and her high society connections for the exhausting reality of the service industry. "Isabella, wake up. Table 4 is yours." David, the restaurant manager, snapped his fingers in front of her face. He was a perpetually sweaty man whose entire existence revolved around bowing to rich men. "Who is it tonight?" Isabella asked, her voice flat, devoid of the panic David constantly exuded. "Dwayne Smith!" David hissed, his eyes darting toward the front entrance. "And he's bringing a VIP, an international investor. Smith requested the best table, the best service, and he explicitly told me that if anything goes wrong, he will personally see to it that my career in hospitality is over. So Isabella, do not mess this up. Smile. Be invisible. Agree with everything he says." Isabella sighed inwardly. She knew exactly who Dwayne Smith was. Anyone who read the local business journals knew him. He was a real estate mogul who had made his fortune buying up distressed properties and flipping them into soulless luxury condos. He was new money, loud, aggressive, and deeply insecure about his status. He was the kind of man who bought a $300,000 sports car, but couldn't drive a manual transmission. The kind of man who ordered the most expensive wine on the menu simply because of the price tag, not the palate. "I'll handle him, David," Isabella said quietly, picking up a silver tray of ice water. She walked out into the main dining room, navigating the labyrinth of tables with practiced grace. Table 4 was a plush, semicircular velvet booth nestled in the most private corner of the room, flanked by heavy silk drapes and an original Matisse sketch. Dwayne Smith was already there. He was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s, wearing a suit that was too tight and a watch that was too large. He was currently barking into his cell phone, aggressively swirling a glass of sparkling water. "I don't care what the zoning board says. You tell them I'll pull the funding for their little community center if they don't approve the permits," Dwayne shouted into the phone, completely uncaring that the couple at the next table was glaring at him. Isabella approached the table, standing at the respectful distance dictated by her training. She waited silently for him to acknowledge her. He didn't. He kept shouting into his phone for another 2 minutes before slamming it face down on the pristine white tablecloth. "Good evening, Mr. Smith. Welcome to Le Chapitre," Isabella said, her voice a calm, soothing alto. "May I offer you—" "Quiet," Dwayne snapped, holding up a thick, manicured hand. He didn't even look at her face. His eyes remained fixed on the entrance. "I didn't tell you to speak. I'm waiting for a very important guest. You don't approach this table, you don't breathe on this table until he arrives. Understand, sweetheart?" Isabella felt a familiar, hot prickle of indignation at the base of her neck, but she clamped down on it. "Of course, sir," she murmured smoothly. "And get me a real drink. Scotch. Macallan 25. Neat. Don't water it down and make it fast." He flicked his fingers at her in a dismissive shooing motion, like he was brushing away a fly. Isabella turned on her heel and walked back to the bar. She had dealt with men like Dwayne before. They viewed the world as a hierarchy, and in his mind, she was at the absolute bottom. There was no point in letting it sting. It was just a performance, a transactional interaction that would end when she clocked out. But as she waited for the bartender to pour the scotch, Isabella couldn't help but wonder who this important guest was. Dwayne was practically vibrating with nervous energy. Whoever was coming, Dwayne desperately needed their approval. 10 minutes later, the front doors of Le Chapitre opened, and the maitre d' escorted a tall, silver-haired man toward table 4. Isabella, observing from the server station, instantly recognized the subtle markers of generational wealth. The man wore a bespoke navy suit that draped perfectly, unbranded, and devoid of any flashy logos. His posture was relaxed but commanding. He walked with the quiet confidence of a man who owned the room without ever having to raise his voice. This was Monsieur Laurent Dubois. Isabella recognized the name from the reservation notes. Dubois was the patriarch of a legendary French family that owned a conglomerate of luxury heritage brands, everything from historic vineyards in Bordeaux to centuries-old leather artisan shops in Paris. He was old money incarnate, and Dwayne Smith, the loud, brash Chicago condo flipper, was clearly trying to secure a partnership with him. As Laurent approached, Dwayne leapt up from the booth so fast he nearly knocked over his water glass. He thrust his hand out aggressively. "Laurent, my friend, so great to see you, buddy," Dwayne boomed, his voice carrying across the quiet restaurant. He pumped Laurent's hand enthusiastically. Laurent smiled politely, though Isabella noticed the slight tightening at the corners of his eyes, a micro-expression of distaste at the volume and the overly familiar physical contact. "Dwayne, a pleasure," Laurent replied. His English was excellent, carrying a smooth, refined French lilt. He slid gracefully into the booth. Isabella picked up her tray, bearing 2 leather-bound menus and Dwayne's scotch. She timed her approach perfectly, arriving just as the men settled. "Good evening, gentlemen," Isabella said, placing the menus before them. She set the scotch next to Dwayne and smoothly poured a glass of still water for Laurent. "My name is Isabella. It is a pleasure to have you with us tonight." Yeah, Dwayne interrupted, waving a hand. He leaned heavily across the table toward Laurent. "Laurent, I told you I'd bring you to the best place in the city. Real, authentic French stuff. They fly the ingredients in daily. You're gonna love it." Dwayne then turned his gaze to Isabella, his expression instantly hardening. "Listen to me, waitress. This is my guest, Mr. Dubois. He's from Paris. I want the absolute best service tonight. No mistakes, no delays. And bring us the wine list, the reserve list, not the garbage you peddle to the tourists." "Right away, sir," Isabella said, her expression perfectly neutral. She gave a slight nod to Laurent, who met her eyes for a brief second. He offered her a very small, apologetic smile, a silent acknowledgement of his host's boorish behavior. Isabella returned it with a microscopic dip of her chin, a subtle signal that she was unbothered, before turning away. When she returned with the heavy, leather-bound reserve wine list, Dwayne had already launched into a loud, boastful pitch about his real estate empire, dominating the conversation. Laurent was listening with the polite, practiced patience of a diplomat enduring a torturous summit. "Here is the reserve list, Mr. Smith," Isabella said, placing it carefully on the table. Dwayne grabbed it and flipped it open violently. "All right, Laurent. Let me show you how we do things in America. I'm going to order us something spectacular, something that really makes a statement." Laurent raised a hand gently. "Dwayne, please, there is no need to be extravagant. A simple, elegant pairing with the food will suffice. I find the food here is often best enjoyed with something understated." "Nonsense!" Dwayne barked, laughing loudly. "Understated is for people who can't afford the best. We are getting the best." He scanned the list, his finger tracing down the column of 4-figure prices. He wasn't looking at the vineyards or the vintages. He was exclusively looking at the numbers on the right side of the page. "Aha!" Dwayne declared, slamming his finger on the page. "We will have this one. The Chateau Neuf du Pape." He butchered the pronunciation so spectacularly that Isabella actually felt a phantom pain in her ears. He had pronounced Chateau Neuf du Pape as if it were a fast food order. The 2018, $2,000 a bottle. That ought to do it. Isabella hesitated. A 2018 Chateau Neuf du Pape was a massive, incredibly heavy, tannin-rich red wine. It was a beautiful wine, but it was absolutely overpowering. "An excellent choice, sir," Isabella began carefully, keeping her tone completely deferential. "However, may I ask if you have decided on your entrees? The 2018 Chateau Neuf is quite robust. If Monsieur Dubois is considering the Dover sole or the delicate sea bass, as I heard him mention earlier, the red might overpower the subtleties of the fish." It was standard practice for high-end servers to guide guests away from disastrous food and wine pairings. It was meant to ensure the guest had a perfect experience. But Dwayne Smith didn't hear helpful advice. He heard a waitress correcting him in front of the billionaire he was desperately trying to impress. Dwayne's face flushed a deep, ugly mottled red. He slammed his hand flat on the table, causing the silverware to rattle. "Did I ask for your opinion?" Dwayne hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "I don't pay you to think. I don't pay you to give me lessons. I am paying for the $2,000 bottle of wine, and you are going to fetch it, open it, and pour it without opening your mouth again. Do you understand me? Or do I need to get David out here to explain your job to you?" The silence at the table was immediate and heavy. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away. Isabella stood perfectly still. The blood pounded in her ears. She looked at Duane, at his bulging veins and his cruel, tiny eyes. He was trying to assert dominance, trying to show Laurent Dubois that he was an alpha male who commanded obedience. Isabella then shifted her gaze to Laurent. The French patriarch looked profoundly uncomfortable. The polite mask had slipped, revealing deep disgust. Not at Isabella, but at Duane. In the aristocratic circles Laurent ran in, treating service staff with such aggressive disrespect was not a sign of power. It was the ultimate marker of low breeding, a glaring neon sign that screamed new money and lack of class. Laurent opened his mouth to intervene, to perhaps diffuse the situation and spare the waitress further humiliation. But Isabella didn't need rescuing. Isabella took a slow, deep breath. The scent of white truffles filled her lungs. For 2 years she had swallowed her pride. She had let men like Duane Smith step all over her because she needed the tips, she needed the shifts, she needed the survival. But looking at the embarrassed, sympathetic eyes of Laurent Dubois, a man who represented the world she had been violently ejected from, something inside Isabella snapped. It wasn't a chaotic, messy break. It was a cold, sharp, surgical fracture. She wasn't going to let this bloated, ignorant bully humiliate her in front of a man who actually understood the culture Duane was trying to buy. Isabella did not apologize. She did not cower. She did not say, "Right away, sir." Instead, she bypassed Duane completely. She physically adjusted her stance, turning her shoulders and directing her full attention exclusively to Laurent Dubois. When she spoke, her voice was completely transformed. Gone was the flat, deferential tone of an American waitress. In its place was the rich, melodious, impossibly chic cadence of the Parisian upper échelon. "Monsieur Dubois," Isabella said, the French rolling off her tongue like liquid silk. "Je vous prie de m'excuser pour cette situation désagréable. Si je puis me permettre, le Châteauneuf-du-Pape 2018 est en effet beaucoup trop agressif pour la seule meunière que notre chef prépare ce soir. Mr. Dubois, I apologize for this unpleasant situation. If I may, the 2018 Châteauneuf-du-Pape is indeed far too aggressive for the sole meunière our chef is preparing tonight." Laurent Dubois froze. His eyes widened, and he sat back in the booth, genuinely stunned. He looked at Isabella as if she had just performed a magic trick. He wasn't just surprised that she spoke French. He was shocked by how she spoke it. This wasn't textbook French. This wasn't the French of someone who had spent a semester abroad. This was the precise, nuanced phrasing, the specific aristocratic intonation of the rive gauche. It was the French of his peers. Duane, meanwhile, was paralyzed with confusion. His jaw was slightly slack. He looked back and forth between his waitress and his billionaire guest, completely lost, like a man who had walked into the wrong movie theater. What did you just say?" Duane stammered, his angry bluster suddenly deflated by his total lack of comprehension. "Speak English. What are you doing?" Isabella ignored him entirely. She kept her eyes locked on Laurent, holding his gaze with a quiet, dignified authority. "Notre cave abrite un Chablis Grand Cru, les clos de 2014 qui serait absolument parfait," Isabella continued, her hand resting elegantly in front of her. "Il a la minéralité et l'élégance nécessaires pour sublimer le poisson sans l'écraser. De plus, son prix est nettement plus raisonnable, ce qui me semble plus approprié pour un dîner où la conversation et la compagnie devraient primer sur l'ostentation." or cela holds a 2014 Chablis Grand Cru Les Clos that would be absolutely perfect. It has the minerality and elegance necessary to elevate the fish without crushing it. Furthermore, its price is significantly more reasonable, which seems to me more appropriate for a dinner where conversation and company should take precedence over ostentation. It was a brilliant, subtle, devastating maneuver. In a few elegant sentences, Isabella had demonstrated a profound knowledge of wine, offered a vastly superior pairing, and delivered a surgically precise insult to Duane's vulgar display of wealth, all in a language Duane couldn't understand. Laurent Dubois stared at her for a long, quiet moment. Slowly, a genuine, brilliant smile spread across his face. It wasn't the polite, tight smile he had given Duane. It was a smile of pure delight and profound respect. The heavy tension in his shoulders vanished. "Mademoiselle," Laurent replied, his voice rich and warm, switching seamlessly into rapid, joyful French. "Vous avez parfaitement raison. L'ostentation est l'ennemi du goût. Un Chablis Grand Cru serait divin. Vous avez un accent magnifique. Êtes-vous de Paris?" "Miss, you are perfectly right. Ostentation is the enemy of taste. A Chablis Grand Cru would be divine. You have a magnificent accent. Are you from Paris?" "J'y ai vécu de nombreuses années, monsieur. Études de droit à la Sorbonne, avant que les circonstances ne me ramènent ici," Isabella replied smoothly, a hint of genuine warmth entering her own voice. "I lived there for many years, sir. Law studies at the Sorbonne before circumstances brought me back here. C'est un véritable gâchis pour le monde juridique, mais une bénédiction pour mon dîner," Laurent said, bowing his head slightly. "A true waste for the legal world, but a blessing for my dinner. S'il vous plaît, apportez-nous le Chablis. Please, bring us the Chablis." "Hey! Hey!" Duane finally barked, slapping his hand on the table again, though this time it lacked authority. It just sounded desperate. "What is going on here? Laurent, what is she saying? What are you two talking about?" Laurent turned his head slowly to look at Duane. The warmth that had just been in his eyes when looking at Isabella instantly vanished, replaced by an expression of glacial, impenetrable frost. "Duane," Laurent said, switching back to English, his tone deadly calm and infinitely condescending. "The young lady was simply preventing you from making a catastrophic culinary mistake. We will be having the Chablis she recommended. And—" Laurent paused, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. "I would suggest you allow her to dictate the rest of the meal. She clearly possesses a refinement that this table is currently lacking." Duane Smith turned the color of ash. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He had just been publicly scolded by the man he was trying to woo, and he had been outmaneuvered by a woman wearing an apron. The power dynamic of the table hadn't just shifted, it had completely capsized. Isabella allowed herself a single, microscopic smirk. "Excellent choice, Monsieur Dubois," she said, in perfect English, looking directly into Duane's horrified eyes. "I will retrieve the Chablis immediately, sir." As Isabella walked away from table 4, she felt the eyes of the entire dining room on her, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. She felt 10 feet tall, and as she headed toward the wine cellar, she knew the night was far from over. Duane Smith wasn't the kind of man to lose gracefully, and she had just humiliated him in the only currency that mattered to him, status. The wine cellar at Le Chapitre was a subterranean sanctuary, a temperature-controlled vault of glass and mahogany that smelled of cork and ancient dust. Isabella descended the spiral staircase, the ambient noise of the dining room fading into a hushed silence. Her heart was still hammering against her ribs, a steady drumbeat of adrenaline and residual anxiety. She had just broken the cardinal rule of high-end hospitality. She had embarrassed a high-rolling guest. She walked past the locked cages containing the first-growth Bordeaux and located the Burgundy section. Her fingers traced the labels until she found the 2014 Domaine François Ravenel Chablis Grand Cru L'Éclos. It was a masterpiece of a wine, famous for its flinty minerality and complex, honeyed finish. She cradled the bottle carefully, checking the label and the foil, preparing herself for the inevitable fallout. She knew men like Dwayne Smith. His ego was a fragile, bloated thing, and she had just taken a needle to it in front of a man whose approval he desperately craved. Upstairs, the fallout had already begun. Dwayne Smith had not sat quietly while Isabella fetched the wine. The moment she was out of sight, he had offered Laurent a tight, unconvincing smile, muttered something about needing to use the restroom, and practically sprinted across the dining room. He didn't head for the restrooms. He made a direct line for the mahogany podium at the front of the house, his face a mask of thunderous rage. David, the manager, was currently reviewing reservations on his iPad when Dwayne slammed his heavy hand down on the podium. "David, we have a serious problem," Dwayne hissed, his voice trembling with suppressed fury. Several diners nearby glanced over, their conversations pausing. David's perpetual sheen of sweat suddenly doubled. "Mr. Smith, is everything all right? Is the table not to your liking?" "The table is fine. The service is an absolute disgrace," Dwayne spat, leaning in close so David could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "That waitress you assigned to me, Isabella, she is insolent, she is arrogant, and she just insulted me in front of Laurent Dubois." "Insulted you?" David paled, his eyes darting toward the back hallway. "Mr. Smith, I assure you, Isabella is one of our most experienced." "I don't care how long she's worked here," Dwayne interrupted, his voice rising a dangerous octave. "She refused my wine order, started babbling in French to my guest, and completely undermined me. I am in the middle of negotiating a $60 million joint venture for the South Loop development. If that deal falls through because your staff doesn't know their place, I will make sure the owners of this restaurant hear about it. I want her gone. Now. Send someone else to table 4, and I want our meal comped." David swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He was caught between a rock and a very wealthy hard place. I understand, Mr. Smith. I will handle it immediately. Please, return to your guest. I will send our senior captain to take over your service." As Dwayne strutted back to his table, feeling a temporary surge of vindictive triumph, Isabella emerged from the cellar, the Ravenel resting gracefully on a white linen napkin over her forearm. David intercepted her before she could cross into the main dining room. He grabbed her by the elbow and yanked her into the narrow, dimly lit service corridor next to the kitchen doors. "What did you do?" David demanded, his voice a panicked, breathless whisper. Isabella calmly removed her arm from his grip. "I prevented Mr. Smith from serving a heavy Chateauneuf du Pape with delicate Dover sole, David. I suggested a Chablis." Monsieur Dubois agreed enthusiastically. "You spoke French to them. You corrected a VIP." David scrubbed a hand over his face. "Smith just threatened to pull his patronage and call the owners. He wants you off the table. He wants you fired, Isabella." Isabella's expression remained stoic, though a knot tightened in her stomach. "David, Mr. Smith was screaming at me. He was humiliating himself and the restaurant. Monsieur Dubois was visibly disgusted by his behavior. If I hadn't stepped in and changed the dynamic, Dubois would have walked out before the appetizers arrived." "That's not your call to make," David hissed. "You are a waitress. You are supposed to pour the water and smile. Give me the wine. You're off table 4. Go help clear the patio. I'll send Gregory over to salvage this." Isabella looked at the bottle of Ravenau in her hands. She thought about handing it over, about retreating to the patio, folding napkins, and letting Dwayne Smith win. It would be the safe thing to do. It would keep her job secure. But she remembered the look of profound relief and respect in Laurent Dubois' eyes. She remembered the world she used to belong to, a world where dignity mattered more than a bloated bank account. "No," Isabella said quietly. David blinked, stunned. "Excuse me." "I said no, David." Isabella stood taller, her posture mirroring the aristocratic grace she had displayed at the table. "Monsieur Dubois specifically asked me to bring this wine. He explicitly told Smith that he wanted me to dictate the rest of the meal. If you send Gregory over there right now, Dubois will know exactly what Smith did. He will know Smith threw a tantrum and had the staff punished for his own lack of refinement." Isabella leaned in slightly, her dark eyes locking onto David's panicked gaze. "If you want to blow Smith's $60 million deal, you send Gregory. Because if Dubois sees that Smith is petty enough to fire a waitress for knowing more about wine than him, he will never sign a contract with him. Old European money despises vulgarity, David, and Smith is drowning in it." David stared at her, his mouth slightly open. He was a man accustomed to blind obedience, but he wasn't stupid. He understood the complex, unspoken rules of wealthy clientele. He looked at Isabella, really looked at her, perhaps realizing for the first time that the woman standing before him possessed an intellect and a strategic mind far beyond her job title. "If this blows up," David warned, his voice shaking. "It won't," Isabella said, adjusting the linen napkin over her arm. "I will handle Mr. Smith." Without waiting for his permission, Isabella turned and walked out of the service corridor, stepping back into the soft, golden light of the dining room. When Isabella returned to table 4, the atmosphere was thick enough to carve with a steak knife. Dwayne Smith was sitting rigidly, a smug, expectant look on his face, clearly waiting for a different server to appear. When he saw Isabella approaching, bearing the silver ice bucket and the bottle of Chablis, the smugness vanished, replaced by a look of absolute, venomous shock. He shot a murderous glare toward the front podium, where David was conveniently hiding behind a floral arrangement. Isabella approached the table as if nothing had happened. She moved with a liquid grace, placing the polished silver bucket on the stand beside Laurent Dubois. "The 2014 Domaine François Ravenau, Chablis Grand Cru, Les Clos, gentlemen," Isabella announced smoothly, presenting the label to Laurent for his inspection. Laurent's eyes lit up. He reached out and gently touched the glass of the bottle. "Un choix exceptionnel, Isabella. Ravenau est inégalable." "An exceptional choice, Isabella. Ravenau is unparalleled." Noticeably, Laurent had dropped the formal mademoiselle and used her first name, having read it off her discreet brass name tag. It was a subtle shift, a bridging of the gap between server and patron, signaling a level of personal respect that made Dwayne physically twitch. "Yes, well, let's hope it's worth the wait," Dwayne muttered, trying to regain control of the narrative. "Laurent, as I was saying about the zoning permits for the River North project—" "Dwayne, please," Laurent interrupted, his tone gentle but firm, holding up a single, perfectly manicured hand. "The wine is being opened. Let us respect the ritual." Dwayne snapped his mouth shut, his face flushing again. Isabella smoothly cut the foil, her hand steady, the silver wine key gleaming in the low light. She extracted the long, pristine cork without a single sound, a mark of true professional service, and placed it on a small silver coaster near Laurent's right hand. She poured a small tasting measure into Laurent's crystal glass and stepped back, waiting. Laurent picked up the glass by the stem. He didn't swirl it aggressively like Duane had done with his water. He gently rotated his wrist, observing the slow, heavy tears of the wine clinging to the glass. He brought it to his nose, closing his eyes as he inhaled the complex bouquet of crushed stones, white flowers, and faint citrus. Finally, he took a sip, letting it coat his palate before swallowing. A slow, satisfied sigh escaped his lips. He opened his eyes and looked directly at Isabella. "Perfection," Laurent said in English, ensuring Duane understood. "It sings." "Thank you, Isabella." "My pleasure, Monsieur Dubois," Isabella replied, moving to pour a full glass for him, and then a glass for a deeply miserable Duane. "So," Duane said loudly, desperate to reclaim the spotlight the moment Isabella finished pouring. "Laurent, the Chicago market is ripe. We are talking about a 20% return on investment within the first 36 months. My firm has already cleared the logistical hurdles." Laurent took another slow sip of his Chablis. He looked at Duane with a polite, vacant expression, the kind of look one gives a persistent street vendor. "Fascinating, Duane. Truly," Laurent murmured, though his tone suggested it was anything but. Then, completely ignoring Duane's business pitch, Laurent turned his entire body toward Isabella, who was preparing to step away from the table. "Isabella, wait a moment, please," Laurent requested. Isabella paused, clasping her hands gracefully behind her back. "Yes, Monsieur Dubois?" "You mentioned earlier that you studied law at the Sorbonne," Laurent said, his sharp blue eyes studying her face intently. "You have the accent of the 7th arrondissement. But your name tag says Hayes. It is an English or American name, yet you carry yourself like a daughter of the Faubourg Saint-Germain." Duane practically groaned in frustration. "Laurent, she's a waitress. Let her get back to work so we can discuss the joint venture." Laurent didn't even blink in Duane's direction. His focus remained entirely on Isabella. Hayes is a familiar name in my circles. A few years ago, I had the distinct pleasure of crossing paths with an American in Paris. A brilliant mind. An international trade consultant who navigated European tax law better than my own legal team. His name was Thomas Hayes. The air in Isabella's lungs suddenly vanished. The dining room around her seemed to blur. The clinking of silverware, the low jazz playing overhead, the suffocating presence of Duane Smith. It all faded into white noise. She stared at Laurent Dubois. He wasn't just making small talk. He was testing a hypothesis. He recognized the poise, the education, and the specific cadence of her speech. He was putting the pieces together. Isabella swallowed the sudden, sharp lump in her throat. She had spent 5 years running from her past, hiding her grief beneath starched aprons and exhausting shifts. To hear her father's name spoken aloud in this room by a man of Laurent's stature felt like a physical blow. "Yes," Isabella said, her voice dropping to a quiet, steady whisper. "Thomas Hayes." "He was a formidable man," Laurent continued, his voice softening with genuine reverence. "He single-handedly brokered a tariff agreement in Geneva that saved my family's vineyards millions. I respected him deeply. I heard the tragic news of his passing and the unfortunate financial complications that followed." Laurent's eyes searched her face, filled with sudden, profound understanding. "Are you?" Isabella lifted her chin. She refused to look ashamed. She had survived the collapse of her world, and she had kept her mother from bankruptcy. There was no shame in honest labor, no matter what men like Duane Smith thought. "I am his daughter," Isabella stated clearly, pride ringing in her voice. "Thomas Hayes was my father." Silence descended upon table 4. It wasn't the awkward, tense silence of Duane's earlier tantrum. It was a heavy, monumental silence of revelation. Laurent Dubois slowly set his wine glass down. He looked at Isabella, standing before him in a server's uniform, and the pieces finally clicked into place. The fluency, the grace, the profound knowledge of high-end vintages. She wasn't a waitress who had learned to imitate the elite. She was the elite, forced by tragedy into servitude. Mon Dieu, Laurent whispered, his eyes widening with shock and a deep, empathetic sorrow. He immediately stood up from the booth. It was a staggering breach of restaurant protocol. A billionaire patriarch did not stand up for a server. But Laurent Dubois was not standing for a server. He was standing out of respect for the daughter of a man he considered a peer. Duane Smith, who had been aggressively swishing the Chablis in his mouth like mouthwash, nearly choked. He stared at Laurent, horrified and entirely out of his depth. "Laurent, what are you doing?" Duane sputtered, looking frantically around the restaurant, realizing people were beginning to stare. "Sit down." "What is going on?" Laurent ignored him completely. He extended his hand across the table toward Isabella. "Isabella Hayes," Laurent said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is a profound honor to meet you. Your father spoke of you often. He told me you were top of your class at the Sorbonne. He was incredibly proud of you." Isabella hesitated for only a fraction of a second before reaching out and taking his hand. His grip was firm and warm. A single tear betrayed her composed exterior, tracing a hot path down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. "Thank you, Monsieur Dubois," Isabella managed to say, her voice trembling slightly. "That means more than you can know." Duane Smith's brain short-circuited. He looked from the billionaire to the waitress, his face a portrait of sheer, unadulterated panic. The woman he had just spent 30 minutes treating like a peasant, the woman he had just tried to get fired, was not only fluent in the language of his investor, she was legacy. She was a living connection to the inner circle of the man he was desperately trying to impress. Wait, Duane stammered, his voice loud and grating, shattering the poignant moment. "You know her? Laurent, you know this girl's father. She works here. She pours water." Laurent Dubois finally released Isabella's hand and turned his gaze upon Duane. The frost from earlier had returned, but it had solidified into absolute ice. The disdain in his eyes was so absolute, it was almost physical. "She works here, Duane, because she possesses a work ethic and a sense of duty that you clearly lack," Laurent said, his voice cold enough to freeze the wine in their glasses. "Her father was a titan of industry. Isabella is a scholar of international law. And you—" Laurent paused, looking Duane up and down, taking in the too-tight suit, the gaudy watch, and the sheer, desperate vulgarity of the man. "You are a man who shouts at waitstaff to make himself feel tall." Duane's mouth opened, but he was completely paralyzed. The $60 million deal, the prestige, the partnership, he could see it all evaporating before his eyes, burning up in the atmosphere of his own arrogance. Laurent turned back to Isabella, his expression softening instantly. "Isabella, I cannot, in good conscience, allow you to serve us for the remainder of the evening. It is not fitting." Isabella stepped back, professional instinct warring with the surreal reality of the moment. "Monsieur Dubois, I am on the clock. It is my job." "Not anymore," Laurent said softly, a spark of definitive action igniting in his eyes. The dining room of Le Chapitre had achieved a new level of acoustic stillness. The clinking of silverware had ceased. Diners at adjacent tables were no longer pretending to look at their phones. They were openly staring at table 4. In the rarefied air of ultra-fine dining, a loud argument was a faux pas, but a billionaire standing up to honor a waitress was a paradigm shift. Dwayne Smith was drowning in the silence. The $60 million South Loop development, the project that was supposed to elevate him from a regional condo flipper to an international real estate player, was disintegrating before his eyes. He scrambled to salvage it, his voice losing its booming authority and taking on the reedy, desperate pitch of a cornered animal. "Laurent, please, sit down. You're causing a scene," Dwayne hissed, his hands fluttering nervously over the pristine white tablecloth. "I apologize if I was abrasive. I just demand excellence, you know that. It's business. It's how we operate in Chicago. Now, about the permits. There will be no discussion of permits, Dwayne," Laurent said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. He did not sit. He remained standing, tall and imperious, an immovable object in a bespoke suit. There will be no joint venture. There will be no South Loop development bearing the Dubois name. Dwayne physically recoiled as if he had been slapped. All the blood drained from his face, leaving his heavily tanned skin looking sallow and sickly. "You can't be serious. Over this? Over a misunderstanding with the wait staff? We have a letter of intent." "A letter of intent is not a binding contract," Laurent countered smoothly, his French accent sharpening the edges of his English consonants. "And this is not over a misunderstanding. It is over a fundamental failure of character." Laurent finally tore his gaze away from Isabella and looked down at Dwayne. There was no anger in his expression, only a clinical, devastating pity. "In my family's business, we do not invest in properties, Dwayne. We invest in partners," Laurent explained, speaking slowly, as if addressing a particularly slow child. "A man who treats those he perceives as beneath him with cruelty and contempt is a man who operates entirely on fear and ego. If you are willing to humiliate a young woman over a bottle of wine simply because you hold the purse strings, what will you do to my family's assets when the market turns? What unethical corners will you cut when you are under pressure?" "That's not fair," Dwayne protested loudly, slamming his fist on the table, though the gesture was weak and trembling. "I am a respected businessman. I built my company from the ground up." "You built a balance sheet," Laurent corrected coldly. "You bought a sports car. You bought an expensive suit. But you cannot buy class, Dwayne, and you certainly cannot buy the right to speak to the daughter of Thomas Hayes like a dog." At that exact moment, David, the perpetually sweating restaurant manager, materialized at the edge of the booth. He had seen the commotion from the podium and had rushed over, terrified that his worst nightmare was unfolding. He saw Laurent standing, Dwayne hyperventilating, and Isabella standing calmly with the wine bottle. "Mr. Smith, Monsieur Dubois, is everything all right?" David stammered, his eyes darting frantically between them. "Isabella, what have you done? I told you to step away from this table." Dwayne saw David as a lifeline, a chance to reassert his dominance and prove to Laurent that he was in control. "David," Dwayne barked, pointing a shaking finger at Isabella, "I told you I wanted her gone. She has deliberately antagonized my guest and ruined this dinner. I want her fired immediately. Do it right now, or I swear to God I will have this place shut down." David blanched. He turned to Isabella, his expression hardening into panic-driven anger. "Isabella, give me your apron. You're done. Go to the office and pack your—" "Stop!" Laurent's voice cut through the air like a guillotine blade. David froze, his mouth hanging open. Laurent turned his glacial gaze onto the manager. "If you terminate this young woman's employment, or if you even attempt to remove her from this room, I will make a single phone call to the primary investors of this restaurant group. I sit on the board of the holding company that owns the building you are currently standing in. Do you understand me, David?" David looked like he was going to pass out. He nodded mutely, swallowing hard. "Excellent," Laurent said, turning his back on David and Dwayne entirely. He looked at Isabella, his expression instantly softening, returning to the warm, respectful demeanor of a Parisian gentleman. "Isabella," Laurent said softly, "please take a seat." He gestured gracefully to the empty space in the curved velvet booth next to him, directly across from a hyperventilating Dwayne. Isabella hesitated. Her mind was reeling. For 2 years, this dining room had been her prison, a place where she was required to swallow her pride and erase her identity. To cross the invisible barrier from server to guest was unthinkable. "Monsieur Dubois, she began, glancing down at her uniform. "It is against every policy." "Policies are for employees," Laurent said with a gentle smile. "You are my guest, and I believe we have much to discuss regarding your father's legacy and your own future." Isabella looked at Dwayne. The millionaire was slumped against the leather, his face a portrait of utter defeat and profound humiliation. His power play had spectacularly backfired, leaving him exposed as a fraud in front of the very elite he worshipped. Isabella reached around to the small of her back and untied the knot of her starched white apron. She folded it meticulously and handed it to a paralyzed David. Then, with the same aristocratic grace she had walked the halls of the Sorbonne, Isabella Hayes slid into the plush velvet booth of table 4. Laurent smiled brilliantly. He reached across the table, completely ignoring Dwayne, and picked up the bottle of 2014 Domaine François Ravenel Chablis. He poured a generous measure into a fresh crystal glass and handed it to Isabella. "To Thomas," Laurent toasted quietly, raising his glass. "To Thomas," Isabella echoed, her voice steady and clear. The wine touched her lips, and it tasted like freedom. Dwayne Smith couldn't take it anymore. The sight of the waitress he had tried to crush sitting across from him, drinking a $2,000 bottle of wine with a billionaire who had just torpedoed his career, was too much for his fragile ego to bear. He scrambled out of the booth, his expensive suit rumpled, his face a blotchy crimson. He didn't say a word. He didn't look back. He practically ran toward the exit, pushing past the maitre d' and bursting out into the cold Chicago night, leaving his untouched scotch and his shattered ambitions behind him. The rest of the evening at table 4 passed in a blur of exquisite food and intense conversation. With Dwayne gone, the oppressive tension vanished, replaced by a deep, intellectual camaraderie. Laurent ordered the Dover sole meunière, and Isabella, at his insistence, ordered the seared scallops with truffle foam. They did not speak of Dwayne Smith again. He was a footnote, a temporary unpleasantness that had inadvertently served as a catalyst. Instead, they spoke of international law. They spoke of the changing landscape of European trade tariffs, a subject Isabella hadn't discussed with anyone since her father's passing. Laurent was astounded by her sharp, analytical mind. She didn't just understand the law, she understood the political chess game behind it, a skill undoubtedly inherited from Thomas Hayes. As the plates were cleared and a pair of espressos arrived, Laurent leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. The warmth in his eyes had shifted into a focused, calculating business intensity. "Isabella, I am not a man who believes in coincidence," Laurent began, stirring his espresso slowly. "My legal team in Paris is currently navigating a highly complex acquisition of a luxury textile manufacturer in Italy. We have brilliant lawyers, yes, but we lack someone with the specific transatlantic perspective that your father possessed. We lack someone with your grit." Isabella's breath hitched. She placed her cup down carefully. Monsieur Dubois, I haven't practiced. I didn't even finish my final exams at the Sorbonne. I had to leave to take care of my mother's debts. Degrees are paper, Isabella. Intellect and resilience are forged in fire, Laurent stated firmly. You survived the total collapse of your world. You stood in this restaurant, stripped of your wealth and your title, and you maintained your dignity. You handled a brute like Dwayne Smith with more tact and strategy than most senior partners I know. You speak the language of the elite, but you know what it means to work for survival. That is a lethal, invaluable combination. He reached into his breast pocket and extracted a heavy, embossed business card, sliding it across the white linen tablecloth. I am returning to Paris on Friday, Laurent said. I want you to come to my offices on the Avenue des Champs-Élysées next Monday. I am offering you a position as a junior consultant in our international acquisitions department. We will sponsor your legal certification. We will handle your relocation. And the salary will ensure that you and your mother never have to worry about a mortgage payment again. Isabella stared at the heavy cardstock. The gold foil lettering gleamed in the candlelight. It was a golden ticket out of the purgatory she had lived in for years. It was a restoration of everything she had lost. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were tears of profound, overwhelming relief. She looked up at Laurent, the Parisian patriarch who had seen past her apron and recognized the brilliant mind beneath it. I don't know what to say, Isabella whispered, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up the card. Say yes, Isabella. Your father would accept nothing less. Yes, she breathed. Yes, Monsieur Dubois. I will be there on Monday. 6 months later, the skies over Paris were a brilliant, piercing blue. Isabella Hayes walked briskly down the Rue de Rivoli, the heels of her navy leather pumps clicking sharply against the pavement. She wore a beautifully tailored, unbranded blazer and carried a sleek leather briefcase. She paused for a moment near the Tuileries garden, checking her watch. She had a morning briefing with Laurent regarding the Italian textile acquisition, which was entering its final, triumphant stages. She was thriving. The work was demanding, complex, and deeply fulfilling. She had reclaimed her life, not through entitlement, but through undeniable competence and a stroke of poetic justice. Back in Chicago, the landscape looked very different. Dwayne Smith's company had taken a massive, irrecoverable hit. News of Laurent Dubois publicly rejecting him had spread rapidly through international financial circles. European investors, highly sensitive to reputational risk, pulled their funding from Smith's subsequent projects. The South Loop development went into foreclosure before ground was even broken. Dwayne had been forced to liquidate his assets, including the $300,000 sports car, and was currently fighting off bankruptcy proceedings. He had learned the hardest way possible that in the upper echelons of society, money might open the door, but character dictates whether you are allowed to stay inside. Isabella smiled, taking a deep breath of the crisp Parisian air. She turned away from the gardens and headed toward the glass doors of the Dubois conglomerate. She was no longer the invisible woman of Table 4. She was Isabella Hayes, and her story had just begun. The story of Isabella Hayes and Dwayne Smith serves as a stark, dramatic reminder of the profound difference between being rich and being wealthy. Dwayne possessed capital, but he lacked the fundamental currencies of true power, empathy, refinement, and basic human decency. He believed his bank account gave him the right to act as a tyrant, failing to realize that his cruelty was merely a billboard broadcasting his deepest insecurities. Isabella, conversely, had lost her financial standing, but retained her true wealth, her education, her dignity, and her resilient spirit. When the pressure mounted, Twain collapsed into a vulgar display of ego, while Isabella rose with aristocratic grace. Ultimately, the dining room of Le Chapitre became a courtroom of character. It proved that pedigree isn't about the money you inherit, but the grace you exhibit when the world strips everything else away. True class cannot be bought. It is a posture of the soul,